Far beneath the roots of the misty mountains, where the world grows thin and memory becomes stone, a shadow stirs. It is a shadow with wings of darkness and a whip of flame, awakening from centuries of slumber in the deepest places of the earth. The dwarves called it Durin's Bane. The elves whispered of it in their ancient tongues as a creature of the elder days. But when Gandalf the Grey first sensed its presence in the black depths of Moria, he did something that shocked even his companions. He trembled with fear. This is the wizard who had walked Middle-earth for over 2,000 years. The same Gandalf who had faced the Nazgul at Weathertop, who had stood against Sauron's will in Dol Guldur, who would later defy the Witch King at the gates of Minas Tirith without flinching. Yet here, in the tomb silence of Khazad-dûm, something in the darkness made even this Maia of the Valar afraid. But why? What could inspire such terror in one of the Istari? Was it merely the raw, terrible power of the Balrog? Or was there something deeper, something more personal and ancient that bound these two beings together in a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of Middle-earth? Tonight, we descend into the shadows of Moria and the deeper shadows of memory to uncover a truth that Tolkien wove into the very fabric of his legendarium. A truth about fear, sacrifice, and the terrible weight of immortal memory. What did Gandalf see in the Balrog that made him tremble? The answer lies not in the darkness of Moria, but in the light of Valinor itself, and in a recognition so profound it would ultimately transform a wizard's fear into the forge of his greatest victory. To understand Gandalf's terror, we must first understand what Tolkien himself intended when he crafted this moment. The master of Middle-earth was never content with simple explanations, and every word he wrote had layers of meaning that stretched back to the creation of his world. In his letters, his notes, and the careful architecture of the Silmarillion, Tolkien left us the pieces of a puzzle that reveals the true nature of the confrontation at the bridge of Khazad-dûm. Gandalf was not merely a wizard. This truth, so easily forgotten in the heat of adventure, forms the foundation of everything that follows. He was one of the Istari, the order sent from Valinor in the Third Age, but even this title barely hints at his true nature. In the Undying Lands, before time and tide brought him to the Grey Havens in the shape of an old man, he was known as Olórin, a Maia, a divine spirit in service to the Valar themselves. The Istari were given a mission wrapped in profound limitations. They came to Middle-earth clothed in the bodies of men, subject to weariness, hunger, and even death. They were forbidden to reveal their true power, forbidden to dominate the peoples they came to aid, forbidden to match might with might against the Dark Lord. Their strength was to be found in wisdom and guidance, not in the terrible glory they had once possessed in the West. Gandalf carried within him the power of one who had dwelt in light beyond mortal comprehension, yet he was bound to walk Middle-earth as a frail old man with a staff and a pointed hat. This was the nature of his sacrifice, and it was also the source of his vulnerability. Every day he spent in Middle-earth was a day of self-imposed restraint, a constant choice to remain small, when his true nature yearned to blaze forth in all its divine majesty. The Valar had sent him not as a conqueror, but as a servant, and in that service lay both his greatest strength and his most terrible weakness. For over 2 millennia, this arrangement had served Middle-earth well. Gandalf the Grey had walked among elves and men, dwarves and hobbits, kindling courage where he found despair, offering wisdom where ignorance threatened to overwhelm hope. He had faced orcs and wolves, dark sorcerers and the servants of shadow, always trusting in the boundaries placed upon him by his masters in the West. But in the darkness beneath Moria, those boundaries would be tested as they had never been tested before. Because this was no ordinary foe awaiting him in the deep places of the earth. This was no mere beast or corrupted servant of darkness. This was a remnant of the First Age, a survivor of wars that had broken continents and reshaped the very face of Arda. This was something that remembered the music of creation itself and had chosen to sing discord. Before the sun and moon first rose over Middle-earth, before the race of men awoke under starlight, before even the elves had seen the light of the two trees of Valinor, there was war in heaven itself. Melkor, the mightiest of the Vala, had fallen into darkness and taken with him a host of the Maia, those divine spirits who served the powers of the world. Among these fallen spirits were beings of such terrible majesty that their very names became words of power and dread. The Balrogs were once creatures of light and fire, servants of Ola the Smith, in the days when the world was young and unmarred by shadow. They were spirits of forge flame and the pure fire of creation, beings whose beauty was beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. But Melkor's rebellion touched even these exalted spirits, and in their fall from grace, they became something far more terrible than they had ever been beautiful. Twisted by their master's malice, cloaked in shadow and wreathed in flame, the Balrogs became the scourges of the elder days. They were Morgoth's most terrible servants, demons whose very presence could turn the tide of battle, whose whips of fire could drag down the mightiest heroes of the First Age. When Morgoth made war upon the elves, it was the Balrogs who led his hosts from the iron fortress of Angband. The chronicles of those ancient days speak of their deeds in hushed tones, even now, ages after their supposed destruction. At Dagor Nuin Gileath, the Battle of the Stars, it was Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, who struck down Feanor himself, the mightiest of all the Noldor. The maker of the Silmarils, the elf lord whose craft had never been equaled, fell to the flames of Morgoth's captain while his sons watched in horror. When the hidden city of Gondolin was betrayed and its secret passes revealed, it was the Balrogs who led the final assault. They came with whips of flame and swords of fire, and even the valor of Glorfindel of the Golden Flower could not hold them back forever. The great elf lord died in single combat with a Balrog upon the slopes of the encircling mountains, and though he dragged his foe down with him into the abyss, the city of Turgon was lost, and with it, the last hope of the hidden kingdom. These were not mere monsters or beasts of shadow. The Balrogs were fallen angels, corrupted gods whose power rivaled that of the Valar themselves in certain spheres of influence. They were beings who had witnessed the creation of the world, who had once sung in harmony with the music of the Ainur, and whose rebellion had helped to mar the very foundations of reality. Each one was a force of nature given malevolent will, a fragment of divine power turned to the service of ultimate darkness. And yet, the chronicles tell us, they were not infinite in number. 7 there were, according to some accounts, though others speak of more. But whether 7 or 70, the wars of the First Age had taken their toll. One by one, the great heroes of the elder days had brought them down, always at terrible cost, always with the loss of light that could never be replaced. Glorfindel and his Balrog perished together. Ecthelion of the Fountain slew Gothmog himself in the final battle of Gondolin, though the effort cost him his life. By the end of the First Age, when Morgoth was finally defeated and cast into the void, it seemed that the Balrogs had passed out of the world forever. The breaking of Thangorodrim had buried them beneath mountains of rubble. The changing of the world had remade geography itself. Middle-earth entered a new age, and the terror of Morgoth's flame-wreathed servants became merely a memory preserved in the songs of the Eldar. and yet most had been destroyed, all but one. Deep beneath the misty mountains, the dwarves of Durin's folk had built the greatest of all their kingdoms. Khazad-dûm, they called it in their own tongue, the mansion of the dwarves, though it would later be known by the Sindarin name of Moria. For long ages, it had been a realm of wonder, its halls carved from living stone, its passages lit by crystal and mithril, its forges ringing with the sound of hammers upon anvils blessed by Olórin himself. The dwarves were miners and craftsmen beyond compare, delving ever deeper into the roots of the mountains, following veins of precious metal and seams of gems into the very heart of the earth. They found silver and gold, copper and iron, and rarest of all, they found mithril, true silver, the metal beyond price that could be worked like copper, yet was harder than steel and light as silk. The mithril of Moria was coveted by elves and men alike, and the wealth of Durin's kingdom grew beyond measure. But wealth and wonder could not satiate the dwarven hunger for the treasures of the deep. Generation after generation pushed the boundaries of their realm further into darkness, driven by an almost mythical greed for the riches that lay hidden in the bones of the world. They delved greedily and too deep, as Gandalf would later say, and in their hunger for mithril, they awakened something that should have slept until the ending of the world. In the depths beneath Barad-dûr, the Red Horn, in chambers so deep that they bordered on the roots of the world itself, the dwarves broke through into spaces that had been sealed since the Elder Days. They found mithril there, yes, more mithril than they had ever dreamed. But they found something else as well. In a shaft so deep that no light had touched its walls for 6,000 years, something stirred at the sound of dwarven hammers. Something opened eyes like coals of fire and stretched wings that had not felt the wind since the skies above Gondolin had burned with dragon flame. Durin's Bane awakened. The chronicles of that awakening have been lost, buried with the dwarves who witnessed the first moments of their kingdom's fall, but we know the aftermath all too well. The creature that emerged from the deep places was no mere beast or troll grown large in darkness. It was a demon of shadow and flame, a relic of wars so ancient that even the elves of Rivendell spoke of them only in whispers. King Nine I fell before it in the year 1981 of the Third Age, and with his death, the doom of Moria was sealed. The dwarves fled their ancient home in such haste that they left behind treasures that would have ransomed kingdoms. The halls that had rung with song and hammer blow fell silent. The lights went out one by one, and darkness crept through passages that had once blazed with the glory of Durin's craft. Moria became a tomb, a place of shadow haunted by something so terrible that even the orcs feared to tread its deepest halls. For over 1,000 years, Durin's Bane ruled the darkness beneath the mountains. Occasionally, brave companies of dwarves would attempt to reclaim their ancient home, but none ever returned. The Balrog had made Moria its kingdom, and in the lightless depths, it waited with the patience of immortal malice for prey worthy of its attention. That prey would come at last in the form of 9 companions seeking passage beneath the misty mountains, and among them walked one who would recognize the ancient enemy for what it truly was, not merely by the shadow and flame that announced its presence, but by something far deeper and more terrible. When Gandalf first sensed the Balrogs stirring in response to their intrusion, he did not merely sense a monster in the dark. He recognized a kin of his own. This was the true source of Gandalf's fear, the recognition that struck him like a blow to the heart as the Fellowship fled through the halls of Moria. The creature pursuing them was not some beast spawned in darkness or demon summoned from the void. It was a Maia, as he was a Maia. It was a spirit of the same divine order, born in the same timeless halls, shaped by the same music of creation that had given form to Gandalf himself. In the cosmic hierarchy of Tolkien's universe, Both Gandalf and the Balrog stood as equals in fundamental nature. They were both Ainur, both servants of the Valar in the beginning, both witnesses to the creation of the world. The difference between them was not one of essential nature, but of choice. The choice between light and darkness, between service and rebellion, between the harmony of the music and the discord of Melkor's theme. But this equality of nature made their confrontation infinitely more personal and terrifying than any battle between wizard and monster could ever be. Gandalf was not facing an alien enemy whose motivations he could not fathom. He was facing a dark mirror of himself, a being who had once stood where he stood, who had once served where he served, and who had chosen to fall so far from grace that redemption was no longer possible. The horror of this recognition went beyond fear of physical destruction. Gandalf knew that the Balrog was everything he himself might have become if he had chosen differently, if he had heeded Melkor's song instead of Eru's, if he had sought dominion instead of service. In the flames of Durin's Bane, Gandalf saw not merely an enemy, but the shadow of his own potential corruption. Yet there was more to Gandalf's terror than this philosophical horror. The Balrog represented a very real and present danger that struck at the heart of the Astari's mission in Middle-earth. Gandalf had come to the mortal lands bound by limitations, clothed in mortal form, constrained by the Valar's command to guide rather than dominate. The Balrog labored under no such restrictions. Here was a Maia who had cast off all restraint, who had embraced the full extent of its power without regard for consequence or collateral damage. Where Gandalf was forbidden to reveal his true nature, the Balrog reveled in its divine might. Where Gandalf was commanded to work through others, the Balrog acted with the directness of absolute power. In their confrontation, restraint would face abandon, wisdom would face malice, and the servant of the Valar would face the servant of Morgoth with all the terrible implications that such a meeting entailed. The power differential was staggering to contemplate. Gandalf, in his role as Gandalf the Grey, was deliberately diminished, his true strength hidden beneath the guise of a mortal old man. The Balrog was a creature unbound, wielding power that had once challenged the might of the Valar themselves. In any direct confrontation, the outcome should have been foregone, victory of unbridled power over deliberate restraint, of rebellion over obedience, of darkness over light. And yet there was more to this ancient enmity than power alone. For Gandalf was not merely any Maia, he was Olórin, and his memories stretched back to the very foundations of the world. In the timeless halls of Valinor, before the counting of years began and the world grew solid beneath the weight of history, Olórin had dwelt among the Valar as a spirit of wisdom and compassion. He had served Manwë, the Elder King, learning the ways of wind and air, the paths of eagles, and the secrets of the sky. He had also spent long ages in the halls of Nienna, she who mourns for all the hurts of the world, learning pity and patience and the hope that lives beyond despair. But Valinor in those days was not the peaceful realm it would later become. The discord that Melkor had introduced into the music of creation had consequences that rippled through all the ages of the world, and even in the Blessed Realm there was strife and sorrow. Olórin had been present when Melkor corrupted the Maia, turning spirits of light into creatures of shadow. He had witnessed the fall of those who would become the Balrogs, had perhaps even known them before their corruption, had seen the moment when eternal light chose eternal darkness. The memories of those ancient days would have been preserved in Gandalf's immortal consciousness with perfect clarity. Every Maia that fell to Melkor's promises, every spirit that chose rebellion over service, every moment of cosmic tragedy that marked the marring of creation itself, all of this would have been etched into Olórin's memory, like words written in adamant. The Balrog in Moria was not just an enemy, it was a walking reminder of the greatest catastrophe in the history of creation. More than this, Gandalf would have remembered the wars that followed, the chronicles preserved in the Silmarillion, speak of the battles of the First Age as seen by mortal eyes, but Gandalf had witnessed them from a divine perspective. He had seen the Balrogs in their full, terrible glory, leading Morgoth's hosts across the battlefields of Beleriand. He had watched them strike down heroes whose names were still sung in Rivendell, warriors whose valor was legendary, even among the Eldar. Gothmog the Balrog Lord, slaying Feanor at Dagor Nuin Gileath. The unnamed Balrog that battled Glorfindel above the hidden passes of Gondolin. The demons of shadow and flame that brought ruin to every bright thing they touched, leaving nothing but ash and sorrow in their wake. These were not merely stories to Gandalf, they were memories, preserved with the awful clarity that only an immortal mind could possess. And in that cavern beneath Moria, as the sound of great feet echoed through the darkness and the smell of sulphur filled the air, Gandalf knew with absolute certainty what approached. This was not merely any enemy. This was an echo of Morgoth's terror, a remnant of the wars that had broken the world. This was a piece of the ancient darkness that should have been destroyed with the passing of the elder days, yet somehow had survived to threaten the younger world. The recognition brought with it not just fear, but a crushing weight of responsibility. If a Balrog still lived, if one of Morgoth's greatest servants had somehow escaped the judgment that fell upon its master, then the safety of Middle-earth itself was at stake. The creature in the deep would not be content to remain hidden forever. Sooner or later, it would emerge to bring fire and ruin to all the free peoples of the world. And standing between that darkness and the light was one aging wizard, bound by restrictions that his enemy did not share, carrying the weight of a mission that had never contemplated facing such an adversary. Yet even as these thoughts raced through Gandalf's mind, there was another consideration that would prove even more crucial to what followed. The question that had haunted the Istari since their first arrival in Middle-earth. What were the limits of their restrictions? When did guidance become interference? When did service require the revelation of true power? And most importantly, what price would the Valar exact for breaking the bounds they had set? In the darkness of Moria, with the shadow and flame of Durin's Bane approaching, and his companions depending on his protection, Gandalf faced a choice that would define not only his own fate, but the fate of the entire mission of the Istari. To defeat a Balrog, he would need to step beyond the very boundaries that had been placed upon him. He would need to reveal the power he had hidden, to become more than Gandalf the Grey had ever been allowed to be. To face this enemy of the Elder Days, Gandalf would have to risk everything: his mission, his form, perhaps even his very existence in Middle-earth. The fear he felt was not just the fear of physical destruction, but the fear of a choice that could unmake everything he had worked to build over 2 millennia of patient service. But perhaps, in the deepest places of his immortal heart, Gandalf also recognized something else: the possibility that this confrontation was not mere chance, but part of a deeper design. Perhaps the Valar had known that such a choice would one day be required. Perhaps his fear was not a sign of failure, but the necessary prelude to transformation. The analysis of relative power between Gandalf and the Balrog had occupied Tolkien scholars for decades, and the master himself left us tantalizing glimpses of the truth in his letters and notes. Both beings were Maia, true, but their manifestations in Middle-earth were vastly different. The Balrog was a creature unleashed, wielding power that had been accumulated and focused through millennia of unbridled existence. Gandalf was deliberately constrained, his true nature hidden beneath layers of limitation and mortal guise. Yet power, as Tolkien often demonstrated, was not merely a matter of raw strength. In his letter 156, the professor described Gandalf as the wisest of the Maia, suggesting that his authority came not from might alone, but from deep understanding of the music of creation and his place within it. The Balrog, for all its terrible strength, was a creature of discord, powerful yes, but also ultimately destructive to the very fabric of reality it sought to dominate. The confrontation between them was therefore not simply a battle between two supernatural beings, but a collision between two fundamental approaches to power itself. The Balrog represented power as domination, power as the imposition of will through force and terror. Gandalf represented power as service, power as the channeling of divine will toward harmony and healing. In their battle, these two philosophies would be tested against each other, with the fate of Middle-earth hanging in the balance. But there was another factor that complicated any simple analysis of their relative might, the question of Gandalf's restrictions. The Valar had sent the Istari to Middle-earth with explicit limitations on their power. They were not to reveal their true nature, not to dominate the peoples they came to aid, not to match might with might against the Dark Lord. These restrictions were not merely tactical suggestions, they were fundamental to the entire mission of the Istari. The wisdom behind these limitations was profound. The Valar had learned, through the long history of their intervention in Middle-earth, that the direct application of divine power often caused more harm than good. The war of wrath that ended the First Age had required the intervention of the host of Valinor, but the victory had come at the cost of reshaping the very geography of Middle-earth. Entire realms had been lost beneath the waves, and the scars of that intervention still mark the world in the Third Age. The Istari represented a different approach, influence through wisdom rather than force, guidance rather than dominion, inspiration rather than compulsion. But what happened when that approach encountered an enemy that recognized no such restraints? What happened when wisdom faced malice, when guidance confronted rebellion, when inspiration met the raw power of discord itself? Tolkien himself seemed to suggest that Gandalf's victory over the Balrog was far from certain. In his notes, he indicated that the battle was a near thing, a confrontation that pushed both combatants to their absolute limits. Gandalf's triumph came not through superior power, but through superior purpose, the willingness to sacrifice everything, including his own existence in Middle-earth, to protect those he had been sent to guide. This sacrifice was the key to understanding both Gandalf's fear and his ultimate victory. He feared the Balrog not because he was weak, but because he understood the true cost of facing such an enemy. To match a Balrog's power, he would need to abandon the very restrictions that defined his mission. He would need to become something he had never been allowed to be in Middle-earth, a Maia revealed in full glory, wielding power without restraint or reservation. Was Gandalf's victory predestined by the will of Eru Ilúvatar? Or was it the result of a choice made in the depths of Khazad-dûm? The answer, like so many of Tolkien's deepest truths, was probably both. The music of creation contained within it the themes of redemption and sacrifice, but those themes could only be realized through the free choices of the beings who participated in the great symphony of existence. To defeat the Balrog, Gandalf had to step beyond the very boundaries that had been placed upon him. He had to risk everything: his form, his mission, his very continued existence in Middle-earth, on the chance that his sacrifice would serve a purpose greater than his own preservation. In making that choice, he transformed fear into courage, restraint into power, and service into victory. But the battle itself, when it finally came, would prove that even preparation and understanding could not diminish the terrible reality of facing a Balrog in single combat. The bridge of Khazad-dûm became the stage for one of the most pivotal moments in the entire history of Middle-earth, a confrontation that would echo through the ages like the ring of hammer on anvil in the halls of Olórin himself. As the Fellowship fled through the ancient halls of Moria, pursued by orcs and wolves and worse things that dwelt in darkness, they came at last to the narrow span of stone that arched over an abyss so deep that no bottom could be perceived. Behind them came the thunder of great feet and the growing red glow of fire in the deep places. The Balrog was ascending from its ancient lair, drawn by the intrusion into its domain, hungry for prey that had been too long denied. The very stones of Moria shook with its approach, and the air grew thick with the smell of sulphur and smoke. Aragorn and Boromir had already crossed the bridge with the 4 hobbits, but Gandalf remained at the span's far end, his staff planted firmly on the ancient stone, his grey cloak streaming in the wind that rose from the abyss below. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Wizard and Balrog regarded each other across the narrow space. 2 Maia, 2 servants of powers beyond Middle-earth, 2 beings whose conflict would decide far more than their own fates. The Balrog came on like a great shadow wreathed in flame, its wings spreading wide enough to touch the walls on either side of the vast hall. In one hand it bore a blade like a tongue of fire, in the other a whip that cracked with the sound of thunder. Its eyes were like coals in a forge, and from its nostrils came smoke that darkened the air. This was Durin's Bane in all its terrible majesty, a creature of shadow and flame that had brought low the mightiest dwarf kingdom in Middle-earth. Gandalf raised his staff, and for the first time since coming to Middle-earth, he allowed a glimpse of his true nature to shine forth. The grey wizard became something more, something that burned with inner light, a servant of the flame imperishable standing against the corrupted fire of Morgoth's making. His voice rang out across the chasm with authority that shook the very foundations of the mountain. "You cannot pass," he cried, and in those words was all the power of the Valar, all the authority of the West, all the accumulated wisdom of ages beyond count. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Ainur. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow." The Balrog's answer was a roar that split the stone and a step forward onto the bridge itself. The ancient span, built by dwarfcraft in the elder days, groaned under the weight of the demon's malice. For a moment, the 2 powers stood opposed, light against darkness, service against rebellion, the flame that kindles against the fire that consumes. Then the Balrog raised its sword of fire and brought it down with all the force of its immortal hatred. Gandalf's staff met the blow, and the clash sent shockwaves through the mountain that could be felt in the halls of Rivendell 100 miles away. Sword met staff, shadow met light, and for an instant the very fabric of reality seemed to strain under the pressure of their opposed wills. The bridge held, but barely. Cracks appeared in the ancient stone, and dust rained down from the ceiling far above. The Balrog pressed forward, its whip snaking out to coil around Gandalf's legs, trying to drag him into the abyss below. But the wizard stood firm, drawing on reserves of power he had not touched in 2,000 years of wandering Middle-earth. With a word of power in the ancient tongue, Gandalf struck the bridge with his staff. The stone, already weakened by the force of their conflict, finally surrendered to the inevitable. With a sound like the breaking of the world, the span cracked and crumbled, and the Balrog fell backward into the abyss, its roar of fury echoing from the depths until it faded into silence. For a moment, Gandalf swayed on the edge of the precipice, and hope flickered in the hearts of his companions. The enemy was defeated, the bridge was broken, and the way ahead lay clear. But even as he turned to follow them to safety, the Balrog's whip lashed out one final time from the depths below. The thongs of fire wrapped around Gandalf's knees, and with a crack like breaking thunder, they pulled him down into the darkness. "Fly, you fools!" were his last words as he fell, and in them was both command and blessing, both farewell and hope. The wizard vanished into the abyss, locked in combat with the Balrog, falling through darkness toward a confrontation that would shake the very roots of the mountains. But his fall into the abyss was only the beginning of his trial. not the end. In the depths beneath Khazad-dûm, in places where no light had shone since the making of the world, Gandalf the Grey fought the Balrog through caverns measureless to man. They battled in the deep places where the bones of the earth were laid bare, where the secret fires of creation still burned in hidden sea, hambers carved by no hand of dwarf or elf or man. The fight raged for days uncounted, through passages that led ever downward into the very foundations of the misty mountains. Sword of fire met staff of power, shadow wrestled with light, and the echoes of their battle rang through stones that remembered the music of creation itself. Neither could gain the advantage, for both were Maia, both were beings of power beyond mortal comprehension, and both fought with the desperate fury of those who knew that defeat meant more than death. But gradually, through trial and torment, through the crucible of combat in the uttermost darkness, Gandalf began to change. The restrictions that had bound him, the limitations that had defined his mission in Middle-earth, were being burned away by the fires of necessity. To match the Balrog's power, he had to become more than Gandalf the Grey had ever been. He had to embrace his true nature as a Maia, to draw upon the full extent of his divine heritage. The transformation was not without cost. Each day of battle aged him beyond the counting of mortal years. Each blow exchanged stripped away another layer of the mortal guise that had hidden his true nature. By the time their conflict finally brought them to the peak of Sirac-Sigil, the Celebdil of the dwarves, Gandalf was no longer entirely the wizard who had fallen from the bridge of Khazad-dûm. On the peak of that ancient mountain, where the air grew thin and the stars seemed close enough to touch, the battle reached its climax. There, above the clouds and the concerns of the world below, wizard and Balrog fought their final duel. The Balrog's fire burned cold in the thin air of the heights, while Gandalf's inner light blazed brighter than ever before, fed by sources of power he had long denied himself. The end, when it came, was swift. With a cry that split the mountain air and sent eagles wheeling from their eyries in terror, Gandalf asked down his enemy. The Balrog fell like a thunderbolt from the peak, its fire extinguished at last, its shadow dispersed by the wind. Durin's Bane was no more. The last remnant of Morgoth's terror had passed from Middle-earth, and the ancient wrong had finally been set right. But victory came at a price that mortal minds could barely comprehend. The effort of destroying the Balrog, of wielding power he had been forbidden to use, of becoming more than his mission had allowed him to be, had burned away everything that Gandalf the Grey had been. He lay dying on the peak of Celebdil, his body broken by the ordeal, his spirit stretched beyond its capacity to endure. And in that moment of ultimate extremity, as darkness closed around him and the stars grew dim above, Gandalf died. Not the death of mortal flesh, but the death of his form in Middle-earth, the dissolution of the bonds that had tied his immortal spirit to the world of wind and rain and growing things. But death, for a Maia, was not the end. Death was transformation. In the timeless moment between his death on Celebdil and his awakening to new life, Gandalf stood once again in the halls of his masters in the Undying Lands. Not in body, for his body lay broken on the mountain peak, but in spirit, clothed in the light that had been his before the world was made. There, before Eru Ilúvatar himself, the fate of his mission was weighed and judged. The restrictions had been broken, yes, but they had been broken in service to the music, not in rebellion against it. Gandalf had revealed his power not to dominate, but to protect, not to rule, but to serve. His sacrifice had been complete and willing, offered not for his own glory, but for the preservation of the light in Middle-earth. In the divine judgment of the One, this was found to be good. Gandalf was returned to Middle-earth, not as he had been, but as he was meant to become. The grey robes were replaced with white, the cracked staff was made whole and strong. and the power that had been hidden was now revealed in its proper measure. He was Gandalf the White, the head of the Order of Istari, invested with authority to match his purpose and strength to equal his need. His death and resurrection were directly linked to his confrontation with the Balrog, for it was only by facing that ancient enemy that he had learned the true nature of the choice before him. Fear had been transformed into courage, restraint into proper power, and the servant of the Valar had become something greater than he had ever been allowed to be in Middle-earth. When Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli found him again in Fangorn Forest, they barely recognized the wizard they had mourned. The bent old man with the grey cloak and cracked staff had been replaced by a figure of power and authority that made even the fearless Ranger of the North step back in awe. This was Gandalf revealed at last, no longer hiding his light under the bushel of mortal guise, no longer constrained by the limitations that had defined his earlier mission. His fear of the Balrog had been overcome not by denying it, but by embracing the sacrifice it demanded. He had descended into shadow and emerged as a purified vessel of the Valar's will, transformed by the very trial that had threatened to destroy him. The Balrog's ancient malice had become the instrument of Gandalf's renewal, and fear itself had become the forge of hope. The symbolic significance of this transformation resonated through all the remaining chapters of The Lord of the Rings. Where Gandalf the Grey had guided and suggested, Gandalf the White commanded and compelled. Where the Grey Wizard had worked through others, the White Wizard acted with direct authority. The change was not merely cosmetic but fundamental, a reflection of truths that reached to the very heart of Tolkien's understanding of power, sacrifice, and redemption. But perhaps the deepest truth revealed by Gandalf's confrontation with the Balrog was not about power at all, but about fear itself. In the Professor's carefully crafted moral universe, courage was never the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The heroes of Middle-earth were not those who felt no terror in the face of overwhelming darkness, but those who acted rightly despite their terror, who chose service over safety and sacrifice over self-preservation. Gandalf's fear of the Balrog was not a weakness to be overcome, but wisdom to be embraced. He feared the ancient enemy because he understood its nature, respected its power, and knew the cost of facing it. His fear was the recognition of one immortal spirit confronting another, one divine servant meeting a divine rebel, one who had chosen light, acknowledging one who had chosen darkness. The terror he felt was appropriate, measured, and ultimately transformative. In the deeper symbolism of Tolkien's work, fear became the herald of wisdom, the emotion that prepared the soul for the sacrifices that true victory would demand. Those who felt no fear in the face of genuine evil were either ignorant of its nature or already corrupted by its influence. Those who felt fear but acted nonetheless were the ones who could serve as instruments of the music's ultimate harmony. Gandalf's trembling in the darkness of Moria was therefore not a sign of cowardice, but of understanding. He knew what approached from the deep places, because he remembered its origins, its power, and its malice. He feared it because he was wise enough to recognize the magnitude of the threat it represented, not just to his own existence, but to everything he had been sent to Middle-earth to protect. Yet in the end, his fear became the very foundation of his victory. Because he understood the enemy so completely, he was able to prepare for the sacrifices that victory would require. Because he respected the Balrog's power, he was able to marshal his own strength effectively. Because he feared the cost of the confrontation, he was able to pay that cost willingly when the moment came. The lesson embedded in this ancient tale reaches far beyond the boundaries of Middle-earth itself. In Tolkien's understanding, true courage was not the absence of fear, but the wisdom to fear the right things for the right reasons, and the strength to act rightly despite that fear. The Professor had seen this truth demonstrated in the trenches of the Somme, where young men faced terror beyond imagining and yet held their ground for causes greater than their own survival. Gandalf feared the Balrog because he remembered its origin as a servant of light who had chosen darkness. He feared it because he respected its power as a fellow Maia. He feared it because he understood the cost of defeating it would be everything he had been in Middle-earth up to that point. But he also feared it because he loved the world he had been sent to protect, more than he loved his own continued existence in comfortable obscurity. This was the fear that made him stronger than prideful heroes of ages past who had faced Balrogs with confidence and fallen to their flames. This was the fear that prepared him for transformation, that opened his heart to the possibility of sacrifice, that made him willing to step beyond the boundaries of his mission when those boundaries became obstacles to its fulfillment. And so, in the shadow of Moria, fear became the forge of hope. Terror became the foundation of triumph. The trembling of a wise old wizard in the face of ancient darkness became the first step in the salvation of Middle-earth itself. Gandalf's fear was not his weakness, but his strength. Not his failure, but his wisdom. Not his ending, but his beginning. In the deepest truths of Tolkien's mythology, the Balrog's ancient fire served not to destroy the light, but to refine it. Not to diminish Gandalf, but to reveal him in his true glory. The confrontation in the depths of Khazad-dûm was not a battle between enemies, but a transformation chamber where fear was transmuted into wisdom, where restraint was refined into proper power, and where a servant of the Valar learned at last the full meaning of his service. The shadow and flame of Durin's Bane had indeed been terrible to behold. But in the end, it was that very terror that prepared Gandalf for the greater light that lay waiting beyond the darkness, the light that would guide Middle-earth through its darkest hour and into the dawn of a new age. His fear had been the beginning of his wisdom, and his wisdom had become the foundation of his victory over the darkness that sought to consume all light from the world. And in that victory, written in letters of fire across the peak of Celebdil and echoing through the halls of Valinor itself, was inscribed a truth that would endure until the ending of the world. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it in service to something greater than oneself. Gandalf the Grey had trembled before the Balrog because he was wise. Gandalf the White had conquered it because he was willing to sacrifice everything for the light he served. The ancient enemy was defeated, the shadow was lifted from Moria, and the wizard's fear had been transformed into the very instrument of hope's victory over despair. This chapter ends, but many await. Join us, subscribe for more stories.